Good evening. My name is Evan Gregory, and this is Bible Answers. We're going to be looking at the history of the Old Testament canon and kind of going along with what we did last week. We looked at the history of the New Testament, and hope this is useful for you. And as always, this is brought to you by North Columbus Church of Christ, located in Columbus, Mississippi. And our website, scrolling below me, is northcolumbuschristians.com. And you can also find us on our YouTube page, it's North Columbus Church of Christ, and you can subscribe. Please subscribe to our YouTube page, and you can find our past videos there. And so, going straight into the lesson again, we're looking at the history of the Old Testament canon. And one thing that I find interesting, and it reminds me of a friend of mine was telling somebody about. We were actually having a lesson at the church building about the history of the Bible and stuff of that nature, and the person basically just said that they would rather have somebody, I guess you would say, legitimate, like as a rabbi, that they would come in and talk about the history of the Old Testament, or the history of the Bible in general. And what's to me, that I find that to be interesting, because the facts are the facts, regardless of whoever says that. But if you go back and watch your show from last week, the New Testament manuscripts, so these main texts in which we draw the New Testament that we have today, those copies, now again, we don't have the original copies. We don't have original copies of the Old Testament as well. But these copies that we have, the New Testament copies, are older than the Old Testament copies. And so, going into that, I don't think it makes a difference of whether the old or the new, which one is more reliable, or what. But what's interesting is it seems like many people have the idea that the Old Testament is more accurate or more reliable than the New Testament, for whatever reasons. And of course, they have their reasons. But I just find it interesting, because we have these codexes that we have on the screen here. And if you notice, when they were found, when they're dated, that these codexes are younger than these New Testament texts that we have. And of course, I stress again, I'm not saying that these are less reliable. I'm just pointing this out to say, if you are one of those people that have in their minds that these Jewish writings are more reliable than these quote New Testament or Christian writings, and you say, well, they're older, and there's a better history of keeping up with history, and whatever it may be. I question that, but I don't think one is more reliable than the other. I think there's maybe some unreasonable reasoning as to which one is more legitimate. So, just as the New Testament, there are a few main manuscripts, and a lot of these, what we see codexes here, are known as Masoretic texts, and we'll get into that here in a few slides from now. But you notice at least three of these codexes here: the Aleppo, the Leningrad, and the Cairo Codex. So we see the Aleppo Codex that is found in some 1,500-year-old synagogue in 1947. So if it was there at the founding of the synagogue, that it could have been around the year 400. We have the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, several other books as well. We have the Leningrad Codex, which was written around 1010 in Cairo, and the reason it's called the Codex, if I remember correctly, it is because this codex is in Leningrad, or in Russia. I would have to double check that to be sure. And then we also have the Cairo Codex, which was written in 895. So again, if you go back and look at our other video, I believe it's the history of the New Testament canon or whatever, you'll notice that a lot of our texts of the New Testament date to around 400. There are some a little bit later than that, but certainly not dating to 1000 AD or 900 AD. We also have the Leningrad Codex of the Prophets, which were some of the prophets here. It's written in 916. And then we have the British Library Codex of the Prophets. And so this contains most of the Pentateuch, and this dates around the 9th to 10th century as well. And so, again, these codexes are really copies of what we would call this Masoretic text, which is a text that's been these texts that have been copied by these people known as the Masoretes, and they have taken upon themselves to take very careful consideration in copying this text throughout time. So they date to around 500 AD. And you have these families, this Ben Asher family of Tiberius. You have the Masoretes of Tiberius as well. And also, not only did they go about copying the text, if you did any studying with the Hebrew language and just language in general, they changed throughout time. There's need to maybe add vowels or different words, or even different letters as languages evolved. And so this is what some of the things in which they did. There was vowel points inserted above and below lines of text if they needed that. We also see where they numbered verses, words, and letters of each book as well. So really paying attention to what is being translated here, and really making a really organized and tedious translation and copying of those translations as well. And so, again, those codexes are copies from time past, and those Masoretes played a great, great part of having that text being copied throughout time. Another thing that we see that plays a real big part in validating or legitimizing these texts are the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's where they were discovered around 1948. And originally at this time, we see parts of Isaiah and other works, but really what we see throughout time is just more and more fragments being discovered. And since that initial discovery, you have around 25,000 fragments that have been found that date from around the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. So again, that would be 300 years before Christ to the year 100. And here we have a quote. It says, "The scrolls cover a wide range of topics and genres. Perhaps the most interesting are the biblical scrolls, which include texts from every book of the Hebrew Bible, that being the Old Testament, with the possible exception of Esther. Other scrolls are Jewish sectarian writings, administrative documents, deeds of sale, and even divorce and marriage records." Okay, so these biblical scrolls, they include text from every book of the Bible except possibly Esther. Okay, so date from 3rd century BC to 1st century AD. So incredibly old documents that do contain just about every book of the Old Testament. We see that what's called the Great Isaiah Scroll there, it reads virtually the same as a Masoretic text. So this text that we just looked at from 900, the year 1000, that's this Masoretic text, this is 1,000 years younger, 1,000 years younger than this Isaiah scroll. They read virtually the same. So this dates to around 100 BC. And so the only differences that we have are very minor. So there's differences in spelling, grammar, and then there's also some modifications in vocabulary. So there's no change of the text or the meaning of the text. There's just some changes in the language here, which I think any reasonable person would expect from that. We see one manuscript of Exodus, which was written in what's called Paleo Hebrew, which is an old style Hebrew language. You have manuscripts of 1st and 2nd Samuel, which, interesting enough, it says they may offer better readings than those of the Masoretic text. So I don't think they're saying that the Masoretic text is wrong or that it contradicts. It seems as though some things may be clearer to these translators using these Dead Sea Scrolls. And then again, it says most differences are translation differences. They are mostly akin to or virtually identical to the Masoretic text. And here are some variations from this great Isaiah scroll. So it has 37 variations from the present Hebrew text. And so we have mostly spelling translations. There are some that may affect slightly the translation. And so these three that we have here, so we have they were calling instead of one call to another. We have holy, holy instead of holy, holy, holy. So two holies instead of three holies. And then we have sins plural for sin singular. Okay. So slightly different translations, but I mean, this is not very, these are not very different differences here. Okay. And so very, very minute. And so, really what this means, and the reason I bring up these Dead Sea Scrolls is going back to these codexes that we just looked at that were, again, 1,000 years younger than these scrolls, and we see that they're virtually identical except for very, very small significances. And so what we can tell is that using this evidence is that this Masoretic text is very, very, very close to the original text. Here's a quote from Bledin J. Roberts. It says, "The authenticity of the Masoretic text stands higher than at any time in history of modern textual criticism, a standpoint which is based on a better assessment of the history of the Jewish transmission." And then we have another one from J. Weingreen. Says it should therefore be stated explicitly that when we survey the Hebrew Bible as a whole, the incidence of copyist errors is statistically very few indeed. Even allowing for the intrusion of occasional errors in the received Hebrew text, it is remarkable how faithfully it was transmitted. So somebody might say, well, our current Bible is corrupted, or the Old Testament, whatever excuses somebody may come up with to say, well, this is corrupted. It's just not, what we have is something totally different than the original text. And really what we see here, according to the evidence, that's not the case. Okay? Very few statistically very few errors. Okay. Remarkable how faithfully it was transmitted. So what we have currently can confidently be said that we're basically have what was originally written. Okay, so some other, I guess you would say, scriptures and that I think is important to look at. It's what's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now, remember, these are not Jews, but they did have their version of the Pentateuch, or the first five books of the Bible. So this dates back to 400 BC. Now, this is not, I don't think we should be using this as saying that, our Pentateuch should match up exactly with this, because there are known variations from this. And we see some differences that it seems very apparent that is trying to give credence, validity to their way of life. There's some very obvious differences there. And so there's 6,000 variations from the Masoretic text. And so those variations are mostly spelling grammar, but there are some that, again, it seems as though that it's validating the Samaritan way of life, way of thinking during that time. Remember, the Jews and Samaritans, they were not, they were not on good terms with one another. And so I think we would expect that. But the point that I bring this up is that we see that it does match up pretty close to it. And it does give legitimacy to this Hebrew text when we see how close that it does match up, given how old it is, and given how much it does match up with those Hebrew writings. We also have targums, which are called or basically oral paraphrases of Scripture. And so, if you remember, after the exiles, the Babylonian captivity, all of this, they had these scriptures. They had to be translated, paraphrased into another language, into Aramaic, and we see that these targums are always oral. The text is always read from scrolls in synagogues, and so they, we have these scrolls in synagogues. They would be read, and so they would be these oral paraphrases that are given, and so eventually these targums are written down, and we have two targums, or at least two main targums: is Targum Onkelos and Targum Jonathan, which dates to around the 5th century. And so these targums are very close to the Hebrew text, but slight differences. Remember, these are oral paraphrases, so there would be some slight differences, slight technical differences. So we have several references to God that are paraphrased. So, Genesis 3 and verse 8. Difference here says the sound of the word of the Lord of the God walking in the garden. In Exodus 3 and verse 1 says the mountain upon which the glory was revealed. In Isaiah 6:1, the difference in which we see, it says, I saw the glory of the Lord. So these are slight differences than what we see in the Hebrew text. But again, builds the case for the legitimacy of our current Hebrew text here. We have the Syriac Peshitta. I guess I'm saying that right. It's a Syriac version of the Old Testament. So not sure exactly when it was written, but probably in the middle of the 1st century. And we see that the early forms are in close agreement to this Masoretic text. And then we have later versions which are influenced. So they would be slightly different because they're influenced by the Septuagint, which we'll get to later. Then, of course, we have the Vulgate, which we talked about that last week in the New Testament, that it was a Latin translation of the Hebrew, and it was completed in 405 by Jerome. And so one to note is that it also often faced criticism due to many readings from the Septuagint. And so, Evan, what is Septuagint? It is basically just the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. Okay, so this was a translation that is made by 72 translators in Alexandria, Egypt. Okay, and so they really don't know exactly when this translation was made, but the best guess is around, the law anyway. It's around 3rd century BC. Okay, not quite sure when the rest of it was made. And just like today, we have different Bible versions that some may be more of a quote literal text, some may be more paraphrased. The Septuagint is a Greek translation that is a middle ground between literalness and paraphrasing of the text. Okay, so there are differences in how verses are arranged, some other slight variations, but overall, again, they're pretty minor. Here's a quote here of Paul. Remember Paul, he's a New Testament Christian. He quotes Old Testament scriptures. And what we see with this quote here, it says, Paul wrote as a man with the Septuagint in his blood. So remember, Paul was a good, faithful Jew before he converted Christianity. The Septuagint is what he read. Okay, so he was reading the Greek translation of that Hebrew text. Another quote here says, often it is not mentioned how very much of the Septuagint supports the Hebrew text, and even when the Septuagint differs and offers a better reading, it never replaces the Hebrew as the standard form of the text. Okay, Septuagint is good, it is legitimate, but for translators, the Hebrew is always the gold standard. Okay, and so we have that Hebrew, that being the Masoretic text, which has been translated faithfully throughout time, right? And so we see the evidence here. We see the evidence for the Old Testament. We see the evidence for the New Testament. We see these people. These are historical. These are scholars that will say these writings are legitimate. That it is remarkable how good and faithful these writings were translated. And so when we're looking at the text today, I think it's good that we question the text. We say, hey, is this legitimate? Is the writings that we see today what was written 2,000 years ago or before that? And what we see is a lot of evidence that says yes. There might be a slight change in the slight difference in the spelling or something of that nature. But what we see, we don't see changes in which the meanings of the verses change at all. And so I think that should be a great, it should boost our confidence greatly in reading the Bible and having confidence that what we're reading actually is the Word of God. So I hope this has been useful for y'all. Again, this well, we're almost at the end now. But if you got any questions or comments, feel free to leave it here, and I'll try to respond to it. And keep watching. We try to. Well, I'm not very good at it, but we try to have these shows every week, every Sunday night at 7, and try to follow along. And certainly like any input that you have. We also put these videos on YouTube, and you can see our past videos. If you're just watching this now, we got piles of them. So our Facebook page is, our YouTube page rather, is North Columbus Church of Christ, and you can find us there. So until next time, I hope that you all have a good day and a good rest of the week. Thanks.